Hi, this is a demo of IBM Urbancode Deploy. We have an application here that's a pet store. This application is a three-tiered web app, the database on the back end, a Java J2E middleware layer, and some static content as a web front end. I'm running in two different environments, a system integration test environment and user acceptance. Those show up over here where I've got the integration test environment on the left, user acceptance on the right. Now, if we look at what's going on here in the application, we have this idea of inventory. I can see which version of each component is in each environment. Now, what we see here is what is supposed to be out there. Whenever we do a deployment, that inventory updates immediately. Over on the right, we have this notion of compliancy. That's counting up the number of targets in the environment that are associated with each component and telling us how many of them we've successfully deployed that version to. So it's all green here and says 1 of 1. So we got one server for each component and they all have the right version. Now, what do we mean when we say 1.0, right? So let me click in here, and we can see that any given version will have some files associated with it. It might be just one file, it might be a lot of files in some sort of directory structure, but each version has a definitive set of versioned files. Now, where do these things come from? Well, if we look at the web components configuration, we can see that there's various source types. Right? Now, you may have told me that you're using a Maven repository to hold on to your builds. So what we would do is we would pick the Maven type and then point to its repository and provide information for querying it and pulling versions out of the other build tool, artifact repository, or source control system, and importing them into this versions area. Now you saw that my version was named 1.0. Those numbers are going to come from your tool, right? That's going to be the Maven number. That's going to be a label in source control, an asset ID, something like that. Cool. All right. So when we're back here looking at this inventory and it says 1.0, that's talking about some set of files that came from a build tool or an artifact repository or source control or something, some outside tool. All right. So now let's go ahead and actually look and say, well, we had this we said 1 of 1 targets. What were those targets? What's actually in this environment? What do we mean by SIT? And when we open up the SIT environment, we can see that the SIT environment is sitting in some group called the East Coast Data Center. It's made up of 2 agents, probably 2 servers here, app sit EC2 and DB sit EC2. Pretty cool. And that there's an allocation of our components to servers. So we're able to say these are the servers that we mean when we say integration testing, and these are the components that go to each. There's a mapping. This mapping is actually done out in this resources area. We've basically said that this area in the resources tab is associated with the pet store. Now, each of these components, servers, groups, they can have tags. In my case, I have a tag just identifying these components as being used by the pet store. But you could also imagine a tag like blue or green to help support resource grouping with blue-green deployments. Lots of ways to use these. Identifying groups of servers is a pretty good example, though. All right. So won't create any new tags, and we'll come back. So what we can see here in this drill down inventory is that I've got this one server, and on this server I've got version 1.0 of the pet store and the web content. Nice. Now, a good question is, well, how does integration test compare to user acceptance? We might be able to eyeball this from here, but we can get a little more sophisticated and do a comparison and say, let's compare integration test to user acceptance. And what Urbancode deploy will do for us is it'll list out all of the component versions and identify which are in each environment. Now we see a lot of overlap here, but the difference is that PetStore DB version 1.1 is in integration test and not user acceptance. Now here, if we look, we see this 1.0 version is in both, and 1.1 is also in integration test. How are there two versions of the same thing in the same environment? Well, 1.1 was flagged as an incremental version, a patch, something that gets layered on top of the previous version. And so when we deploy it, the old version isn't removed. It's no longer there, like we would have if we deployed a new version of our WAR file. Instead, 1.1 is additive. It gets thrown onto the top. Now, we can get into more detail here, but we'll come back to that later. Cool. So we got this 1.1 version. What's going on with that? Well, if I go shopping for dogs and I look at these two environments, I'll see that in user acceptance, which still has the old 1.0, Bulldog is my first dog. In integration test, it's Bichon. Right? So we've got this new dog added in integration test called Bichon. If I go further and I go shopping, I'll actually see that we've got a broken image here. How sad. So that's kind of the starting point for our demo is we're looking at integration test and we're seeing an integration failure. We have a new version of the database that's not compatible with the content. All right, if I open this up, I can see that this dog7.gif file is not present in that environment. So what we're going to do is we're going to rectify this by deploying a new version of the web content. I have a 1.1 version that we'll push out there. Once that's complete and successful, I'm going to take a snapshot of integration test, migrate all of those changes down to user acceptance. So we'll update both the database and the web content there. Let's go ahead and get started running a simple deployment of one thing to integration test. Now to do this, I'm going to pick my process. I'll choose deploy. And then what do I want to deploy? Just the web content. There are a number of different ways of picking the version to deploy. I'm just going to say pick a specific version from a list. I'll take version 1.1 and I'll go ahead and submit this change. What we'll be able to do is then drill in and see that this component on that server and that data center is being updated. And we can see it progressively update the success history, right? That's ticking up and it's marching along. We can drill into the logs of any of these steps, whether they've succeeded or failed, and see what's going on. Now, for any reason, our plugin step that's running the integration or one of your scripts or whatever is echoing out a password. Well, you can give us that password information as part of the environment config. And we'll identify, hey, we know that that value is a password. You've told us that. We'll redact it from the log automatically. Okay. So this seems to have worked. That all looks pretty good. I would point out that we've got, the good logging. We know which steps are happening, and we've got an audit trail here, right? We get to see who ran it, when was it executed, where did it run, what version was deployed, so we can get to those files again, and what process. Now here we see it was the deployment process. This is at version 15, and there's a lot of versioning here, right? Version 15 of the deployment process. Version 3.42300 of the shell command. And so there's a big emphasis on this auditability and traceability, repeatability with all the configuration, the plugins, and the parameters all being versioned and stored. Now, if we drill into this deployment process, we can take a look at that. And what we see is that there are 4 steps here. They're nice and linear. They're kind of running the same, way that we saw them run in the previous step. And we can drill into any of these, and there'll be some form here with a bunch of settings that describes how you want to do it. So it'll be pretty tailored if we've got a real clever integration, like the download from the artifact repository. You can also run your own scripts. So here, I can see that we ran a command we called remove old content. That was just a shell command, said remove RF. And then there's a clever parameter here, right? There's a property called environment Tomcat home, where we're looking up one of those per environment configs. Now, if we go back to the other tab real quick and we look at how this was resolved, we go to the remove old content and we look at what happened. The body was actually var tomcat set server. So there was configuration on the environment saying this is the value of this parameter in that environment. It gets substituted in and logged. Cool. Now, some people would observe that this process isn't really optimal, right? That if this guy was already out of a load balancer or something, there's no need to wait to remove the old content until the new content is there. I can actually run that at the same time. So I'll just drag that off somewhere on the right and rewire this. How I read this now is when I start, I should begin by cleaning out a scratch directory and removing the old content. Deploy the new content when we've downloaded the artifacts and removed the old. Pretty straightforward. Now you could get clever here and do some more conditional work. So all these little green check marks mean on success. I could say go this way on failure by clicking that check mark. You can get more subtle with the flow control using switch statements. So you can check parameters mid-flight and say, well, on A, go left, on B, go center, and otherwise go over to the right. Cool. Now these integration steps are configured as plugins. Plugins are bundles of integration that you download and load into uDeploy. So for something like WebSphere, there's a lot of steps here where I can do installs and maybe some different configuration steps, a lot of flexibility. And so at this point, I'll show you whichever kinds of integrations you're interested in. There's also some generic steps here for moving files around and editing configuration files. Very normal to do a find and replace kind of step, or to update a properties file, update an INI file, edit an XML file using XPath. Right? Pretty normal, and these are all cross-platform. Okay. The last thing I want to point out here on this low-level process configuration is the Changes tab. Here we have our audit trail of who's been changing the process and when. So this one's been pretty stable, although there does appear to have been one recent change. So if this process failed, I'd go, hey, who's admin? That guy probably just broke my deployment process. If it had been pretty stable for a while, I'd probably look as my first concern to some other source of change. Now these are versioned. You can go back to old versions of these and all that sort of good stuff. Cool. All right. So we'll close that down and point out that if we come back and we look at our process here and refresh, I've got a new puppy, right? Great. There's a dog there. It's really cute. We've got a lot in stock. Clearly time to market pressures. Let's start moving this forward towards towards QA out of integration test, because now our various components are coming together. Now here I'm validating this by just logging into the UI and looking at it. For many of our clients, they're going to be running automated tests at the end of the deployment. Urbancode deploys some really nice integrations there with a lot of the rational testing tools, both the test workbench as well as service virtualization tools in case some of these components aren't actually available to you. We like to say deploy what you have and virtualize what you don't. But we also integrate with other people's testing tools. All right. Now, where were we? Now we're at a point where we've successfully done a deployment into this integration environment, right? That these 1.1 versions are working together. We might ask, well, how does integration test differ from user acceptance, right? So this would be a pretty good time to look at that comparison that we did earlier one more time. We'll go a little deeper on it. So here we see the same discrepancy in the databases. The middle tier Java layer is still the same version. And the web content, we have different versions in different environments. A pretty reasonable question to ask at this point is, well, how does 1.1 of the web content differ from 1.0? Right? What are all the differences? And this files area will actually tell us that this dog7.gif is the only difference. Right? And that's good because that was actually the image that we saw was missing earlier. Cool. If we'd seen a lot of birds and lizards and stuff, we'd have to go test all of those and make sure those were good too. But here we can see that the discrepancy is really small. The change is small. This gives us some confidence. We could also come and look at configuration. This is going to be looking at the per environment configuration and comparing the two environments together. So we saw in the web content that Tomcat Home was relevant there. We saw that referenced, and here are the two values. They're different. But this is a place where we could see that timeouts would be different. Connection strings might be different. It's probably good that the connection strings are different here. But if we're starting to see weird performance characteristics in one environment versus another, this would be a good place to go look and see how they're configured differently. And again, we're going to take care of passwords and not show their values in the user interface. Cool. All right. So testing passed. All is well. The differences are about what we expect. What if we want to migrate what's an integration test over to user acceptance? Well, we don't want to pick and choose versions, right? I'm already forgetting what I saw in that comparisons tab. What I really want to do is take a comparison or a snapshot of integration test and get a name for that content. So I'm going to create a new snapshot and just give it a name, like the November 18th number 1 sit snap or something. This is just a label, just a name. And now basically I have this new versioned thing, right? It's named November 18th number 1 sit snap, and its contents are these versions, right? The two database versions, the unchanged middle tier, and the static content at 1.1. And here we get to see that, as I mentioned, the difference between a full and an incremental version, that's showing up in the UI. Now, what's pretty cool is that it's not just holding the configuration of the components, right? All of the configuration within the tool, right, that's at all related to this, right? So if we come back and we look at this var Tomcat sit server again, the values there are versioned, right? So we're currently pointing at version 7. But if we wanted, we could pick some older version, right? And we know who made all the configuration changes. And so if we wanted to bind this in, we could. And we could say, you know what? In integration test, use this. We could have different versions of the deployment process and bind the deployment of this snapshot to a version of the configuration process. You might say all the configuration is really good right now and I'm worried someone's going to break it. Lock everything down. And what that'll do is it'll take this away from the latest version, which happens to be number 5, to just being number 5. Just like that. Now I'm a little worried about this because I just set this to version 4. I don't even know what that is. So I'm just going to reset all to use the latest config. We'll do the deployment with the latest config. That's the normal way of doing it anyway. All right. Now, from this overview screen, I get to see how this snapshot compares to each of my environments. So all 4 component versions that are part of the snapshot are in integration test. Not a surprise. Integration test is what we cloned. But in user acceptance, 2 out of the 4 pieces are there. So we might ask, well, what would happen if I deployed to that environment? That's why there's the preview. So I can go to the preview and say, well, what would happen if I applied this snapshot? We'll say, well, you're going to deploy the JPET store database at version 1.1 and the web content at version 1.1. The other things are already out there, and we're not going to deploy them. Cool. Nice for impact analysis. Now let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to request a deployment to user acceptance. Now, I would point out that by this time in the real world, there'll probably be different people involved, right? You're going to have different people who have security rights into integration test versus user acceptance. In the interest of time in this demo, we haven't configured that. Now, on that preview, it only showed deploying what was different compared to last time. That's governed by this checkbox right here. Right? It says only deploy the versions that are changed. I could also schedule this deployment. So I could say, oh, don't deploy it now. Deploy it at some point in the future. I could set up recurring policies to say, well, reset to this baseline on some period of time. Normal way of doing this is based on what we call a quality status, saying on a nightly basis, deploy the latest versions that have been approved by dev into the QA environment, something like that. All right. But I'm just going to go ahead and apply this snapshot to user acceptance. So model-driven deployment. But this time, my request for deployment isn't going to run right away. It's blocking. We set up an approval for this environment. Right? So if I come and I approve this request, it'll run. Pretty simple. Right, we'll see the web content getting installed to the web server and or the app server, and the database content going out to the database server. Pretty easy. For the components that didn't change, they're still part of the process. It just says not needed. This resource already had all the versions. Now, I guess one of the things I could do here is look at that approval process itself. Approval processes belong to environments. And this one is done with the same process designer we used earlier. It's just my content over on the left is different. It says start, get the administrator of the environment to approve. So you'll define various roles for environments or for applications. And you'll say, well, I need an environment-based approval or I need an application-based approval. And this can also have flow control. So you can say, well, get this person to approve, and if they don't, then these other people might be prompted to override. Pretty easy. All right, looks like our deployment is successful. And that's good. Let's go ahead and check out our user acceptance environment. As you recall, it used to just have the Bulldog as its first dog. Let's go ahead and refresh. We'll see that we now have a Bichon. And sure enough, we have our image there. So no integration failures in our late test environments or in production. It's a really big theme in Urbancode deploy. It's kind of what the snapshots give you. All right. Now, how did we do that? What was going on with this process? This is something we glossed over earlier, and this is the second level of deployment automation that we talked about in the slides, the orchestration across multiple servers, across multiple components. Let's go take a look. Right. So here it says our overall orchestration process is to roll back the database changes, deploy the application changes. When those are done, deploy the web and the database content. Now what we just saw is these two components down here running in parallel, but not these others. Right? Those two got skipped. So the way to read this process is to look at all of this as a if necessary. Roll back the database if necessary. Deploy the web app or deploy the J2E changes if necessary. Cool. Now, there's a couple ways of dealing with this, right? This is a really simple flow. Had we wanted to do that blue-green deployment we talked about earlier, we could come in here and say, well, we want to deploy the web content only to blue servers, right? And then we might add another step in here for deploy web to green. We would go ahead and pick web content. We'd pick the green tag, and we would save that. Now there were some other controls in here, right? This idea of a max number of concurrent jobs. Maybe I don't want to break these into different groups and tags. Maybe I just want to say deploy to no more than 3 of my servers at a time. Okay. But if you have 30 servers, we'll take 3 out of the load balancer, upgrade them, put them back in the load balancer, do the next 3. Fail fast would govern, well, what if one of those fails, right? If I fail fast, I stop trying to do more deployments. If I leave it unchecked, we'll assume that that was a weird one-off and we'll try everybody else. Up to you. All right. Now, this sort of additional utility steps were available in our earlier area, but I want to speak to them in a little more depth now. There are the idea of locks. So if you want to serialize access to something, a deployment manager, a database, a testing tool you've limited licenses on, you can acquire a lock to some resource, then that'll be respected across all applications. And then at the end, you'll release that lock. You can call other processes, and then you can also drop in manual steps, either the application level or the component level, saying, okay, I can almost automate this process, run this one little manual task by emailing somebody. They do the work. They come into the tool, say, yes, I've done it, and we continue on. Nice. All right. Any other questions on this at this point? Okay, I guess there aren't. Now, at this point, we have a few more minutes. I want to go ahead and take a look at a rollback scenario. Now, one way of doing a rollback would be from right here to say, well, if deploy app fails, rollback app, right? I could say roll back my application. I could grab the J2E. So let's say roll back my J2EE stuff. And I can either do rolling back of undesired incremental versions, or since this is really a full deployment, replace with the previous one I had. So I'd say on failure, go over here and roll back. Right, so I see sometimes people will set up kind of 2 parallel processes, one with a bunch of uninstaller rollbacks over here. And if anything fails or the tests fail or anything like that, they just say, begin my big rollback process automatically. I tend not to do that. Now, the other way is to come and actually run a process. And sometimes people will create a dedicated rollback process. But in my case, I could just apply an old snapshot. Now, why would I want to do this? Well, if we come back and we look at what we have in user acceptance, this dog's actually not a Bichon. And we might not actually have 10,000 in stock, right? QA may have said, whoa, this is all terrible. Let's get rid of it. We'll go back to testing without this terrible dog. Okay. So what I can do is I can apply a snapshot, or you might have a process called rollback. And I'm just going to pick some old snapshot, right? Called baseline, whatever we used to have, submit that request. We'll go through the approval process again. And this time, when we look, the rollback database process will run, right? It's going to get rid of version 1.1, right? Bring us back to the 1.0. And then we're going to deploy the web content, right? We'll get rid of whatever was out there and replace it with the 1.0. And that'll bring us back to kind of our starting point. Now, if we can catch this while it's running, and I was able to do that, we actually see that it's flagged as non-compliant. So remember we talked about the compliancy. 1.0 is what's supposed to be out there, but it's in the process of being deployed. It's not successfully out there yet, and so it's flagged. A few seconds later when I refresh, hopefully it'll have become compliant in the interim and we'll be in good shape. So those are the kind of two approaches for rollback. It'll bring us back to our starting point. You can either just deploy an old snapshot, as long as your snapshot deployment process has the appropriate rollback capabilities. Or, as a result of a process, you can have the process roll back its own components. Pretty easy. All right. So with that, there's a lot more content here. We've got a couple more minutes. Let me go and look at that. There is the idea of processes here. The idea here is that you can have generic processes. So you can use Urbancode deploy as a kind of generic automation tool where you're just running processes out on agents. So if you want to use it for things other than just deployment, you can. The resources hierarchy is where you deal with all of your environments. This is also where you can connect out to a cloud environment provider. So these integrations within the IBM tool family include the pure application system, as well as Smart Cloud Orchestrator and other tools of that type, where we can say, oh, I would like a new environment of this type for this application. It gets spun up, handed over to the application, which automatically assigns the resources, and off we go. Right, so that you can basically provision an application's environment from a single request in Urbancode deploy that integrates out to the cloud environment provider. It's all pretty cool. Then there's the calendar view, where you can see what deployments you've run recently, as well as anything that's scheduled. So had I scheduled a process to run over the weekend, I'd see it out there and I could reschedule it from here. I can also look for an opening and schedule a process from here. Pretty easy. Work items indicate approvals or manual steps that are waiting for me to work on. And then there's reports. This is where we get nice visibility into things like how many deployments have we been doing in this environment. So I might say, let's look over this year. All right, go. And we'll see that basically this environment was quiet until August, in which case we did a bunch. Right? And we're in the middle of November, so we've got fewer. Pretty cool. There's also the idea of a deployment detail report where you can put in some queries looking for things like, oh, I'm interested in pet store deployments to production or something, and it'll bring you up all of the production deployments. You can see who did it, when were they successful.